Right at the start of the year, we made a video all about the new FinCEN regulation, and it was hands down our worst performing video of the year. You see, nobody cares about regulations because regulations are boring. Regulations are restrictions, and in crypto, we're all free, right? Right? And here we are again, but this time it's FATF.
Get off my car before you flip it over, you fat fuck.
You see, if you thought that just because you're decentralized, the regulators can't touch you, well, you might have to think again. There's new guidance, and the implications are startling. You're a VASP.
You're a VASP.
You're a VASP. You're a VASP. Standing up for policy wonks and regulation renegades, this is the Defiant. When thinking about regulatory concerns, it's vitally important you take a balanced view, and that tortuously constructed segue catapults us headlong into this week's sponsors bit. Balancer are now sponsoring our videos, and they're up to some pretty funky stuff now to help ease the pain of high gas costs on Ethereum. Trade as much as you like and recoup most of the gas costs, damn straight. And in their new BAL for gas campaign, traders are receiving 6 figures worth of BAL tokens every week. And with version 2 just around the corner, Balancer is becoming a one-stop shop for DeFi liquidity. Version 2 brings stable pools and weighted pools tightly integrated under a single protocol with flash loans, lending via asset managers, and much, much more. Check it out at balancer.finance. And that does it for the sponsors, right?
There is another.
Oh, there's another one. Are you a DeFi builder looking to fund, launch, and grow your project? Achieve your goals with asiadefi.network, welcoming founders globally to apply to a rigorous venture building program to foster the DeFi ecosystem in Asia. ADN comprises a 12-week program giving DeFi projects hands-on support across product design, tokenomics, liquidity, bootstrapping, governance, community building, and fundraising. Apply and find out more at asiadefi.network. Now let's get back to the fat jokes.
What did you just call me?
I called you fat fuck.
So here's the skinny. On March the 19th, the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, published draft guidance on the risk-based approach to virtual assets. The newly updated guidance now applies AML and KYC rules to stablecoins, DeFi, and NFTs. The FATF's latest guidance is merely an update of some of its past recommendations towards virtual assets, or VAs, and VASPs, virtual asset service providers. However, the updated version now discusses stablecoins, DeFi, and NFTs, as they're now considering decentralized exchanges, DEXs, to be VASPs. And the new guidance suggests imposing AML and KYC on DEX applications as well. Now, the problem here is that the interpretation of what could constitute a VASP is deliberately extremely broad. So broad, in fact, that it could imply to everybody. And if you're categorized as a VASP, it would require you to collect vast amounts of information on the activities of others and could essentially prohibit KYC-free use of decentralized networks. The updated guidance also places emphasis on transactions with non-obliged entities, i.e. private Bitcoin wallets. And the guidance includes denying licensing of VASPs if they allow transactions to and from non-obliged entities, indicating what looks like a serious intention to place surveillance regulation around the transaction flow of virtual assets. Sounds bad, right? And it might well be. I'm not really qualified to talk about this in detail, so I reached out to someone who's been speaking directly to those designing these guidelines for some time now. He's a co-founder of the Shyft network and a special advisor to the OECD. He is, of course, Joseph Weinberg.
We're here to talk about one thing, which is FATF, FATF, or whatever it is. And I know from reading the Shyft medium that you guys are very closely monitoring this situation because it has a huge bearing on what you're up to. Could you give us a kind of broad grounding into what the FATF is doing and why people are sort of starting to get a little bit scared about the new regulations or the advice that's coming through from them?
Yeah, definitely. So The FATF was designed, a little like around 20 years ago. It was designed kind of out of the G20, I would say predominantly. And its job is to monitor, financial flows inside of the traditional financial system and kind of make sure that we're, building standards and policy around, the way in which financial services generally operate, and more importantly, around counterterrorism financing and anti-money laundering. And so that's been like their role, like historically, right? And it's a very like interesting body because it isn't, anchored to a jurisdiction, right? It's more so every regulator, pretty much in the world, at least a part of the G20 and kind of G36, they all come together as a part of this kind of policy formation body, share information and then try to build some sort of standards that they can all operate within. The argument of whether those are fair or not, or whether they're more favoring to the bigger economies, the G7s of the world, is probably a different question. But that's kind of the structure. And historically, they have been effective in places where an industry like ours would have just been so far away from this degree of policy and kind of consideration that it's a lot of people, of course, have never heard of them in many capacities, and it's it's kind of one of these things everyone's like, what even is that? Let alone like, how does this have an influence or an effect in our ecosystem? The last kind of like 3 to 4 years, and what we've really been kind of doing is saying, we've been in the industry for a very long time, and we had this realization about 5 years ago is like, we need to really start focusing on policy, because at the end of the day, the biggest impacts to our ecosystem at scale and in rapid accelerated scale from an ecosystem cross ecosystem perspective is the idea that rules get created across these intergovernmental organizations, whether it's the OECD, somewhat to some degree the United Nations, the G20, of course, and the FATF. And ultimately, that will define how humans interact with our ecosystem in a variety of ways. And so the FATF, of course, came out in 2018 and said, okay, we need to regulate not just the traditional financial system, we need to regulate exchanges today. Because these are the intermediaries that most closely resemble financial institutions. And so, we had recognized that this was just the beginning. And I think like when it comes to DeFi and non-custodial and privacy, which is really, I think, at the heart of the decentralized, core of our space, the guidance or the requirement of what's called the travel rule to the exchanges doesn't really impact people on a personal level, right? And so I think largely everyone has kind of heard of this in some capacity. Doesn't really affect us. It's probably not, something that we need to think about. And so it hasn't really been, I think, the topic of every person's mind in the space. This today is a definite, I think, change to that discussion. And we can walk through all of the areas of change, but this is, I would say, the closest thing to the biggest impact that we will ever face as users in this ecosystem. So less about the services we use, but ourselves as builders and developers and system adopters. That's a fundamental change in all policy. So this is a shift between financial institutions, regulated intermediaries, which are always generally regulated, to redefining what is an entity and what does that mean. And that is a gross change to what we've been used to. That's like a quick background, I guess, really high level. But yeah.
Well, there's a lot to unpack with FATF. If you go on their website, the language is quite aggressive. It's saying, if we do not act, we are basically paving the way for money launderers, terrorists, to move money around freely, and we can't get them. So the onus is on you, nation, you country, you government, to opt into what we're telling you, because otherwise you are basically supporting money laundering. That's essentially the language that's coming out. Are they fear-mongering, or is there a legitimate concern here that actually, yes, there is an access point here for dark money?
Yeah. I'm a very early crypto adopter. I'm much on the privacy side and on the freedom side. But like the reality is like the size of illicit financial activity in the ecosystem is very small. It's probably under 1%, right? So it is very small, right? But I think the reality is like, I hate to say it, but like there are very real realities here. Like I think a lot of users don't realize that like bad people exist, and the actual fact is like these things are used in like really nefarious ways, right? That isn't always the case. And I would say like, the one situation does spoil it for the rest. But like there are actual, illicit activities occurring and they are increasing. And I think like the question is like, how much, what is the certain percentage before like these types of policies become, granted, right? And some would argue never. It's, this is never the right approach. But others would argue like we do need some way of mitigating these risks. And our industry just, I don't think has, been focused on this part of this, like, into co-integration. And so this is, there is validity to it. But to the extent of whether or not it's the right approach in this way is probably a different question.
And it's a 90+ page document, and regulation is one of the least sexy subjects in the world. Is there a degree to which they're sort of gently maneuvering this thing through? Because if no one's really paying attention to it, there's this kind of slow creep, which is what they've been doing traditionally. They go, oh, well, we need to do this, but actually that opens the door for this whole other bunch of things. And then we've basically just got the same situation we've always had, which is we've voluntarily given up control when we might have had an opportunity to push back.
Yeah. So, and that's kind of the way that I think we've largely read this too. Like, we have to remember, like, in our microcosm, we think that we're unstoppable and the ecosystem is just, all encompassing and nothing can like, impact us. I think that we also have to recognize too, is like outside of our little, bubble that is our growing ecosystem, like there are a lot of people that don't like our space, and the majority of policymakers don't understand how anything works. They look at it as complex. They look at it as, in many degrees, childish, and unrightfully so, but just the nature of, how our ecosystem, operates, I think. And so like all of these things come into this question of like, there's a lot of people that are, in these positions that want to just outright ban everything. And so what we read is this document, and in the last like 4 years, there's been a group of us in the ecosystem kind of quietly advising them and saying, listen, like, let us educate, let us like make sure that like you understand like how these things work. Because the more that happens, at this policy level, like the more hopefully they don't take these types of approaches. What we read into this is saying there are tremendous forces at work here. There is big geopolitical considerations that are happening. This is not just a regulatory thing. This is an economic question. This is a central bank question. And I do largely think this document is one of these situations where there is such an explosive growth happening. This policy allows for regulators to kind of do whatever they think is best. It's kind of saying, we're giving you a standard, very, very broad breakdown of so many considerations that is, like, to be honest, to respond to this document, which we had 30 days to do, about the 20th of April, like, is almost impossible. Like, it's way too big. They're pushing this thing through at really granular, complex speed. And it's not, the question is like, are they really open to like our beliefs? Probably not as much as we'd like. And so it bears the question of like, yeah, like they're kind of pushing this thing through quickly. They think that regulators need the global coordinated toolkit. And this is the best way to do it. And what it does is present an entirely new set of, I think, questionable next realities for the space, because like this is starting to just say, hey, regulators, do whatever you want. If you view anything to be of risk, go after individuals in some capacities, go after everyone that's building in this space. We don't really know what to do with it. We're just going to make something very complex and broad, such that like you do whatever you feel is necessary. And I think that that's incredibly dangerous, to be honest.
So I think basically where the rubber hits the road is in this word VASP, the virtual asset service provider, which is a loose catch-all for, I mean, I've read it a couple of times. I still don't, I mean, like a virtual asset service provider could be an exchange, but it could equally be a Bitcoin node or I mean, what is the uncertainty or the fear around virtual asset service providers?
Yeah. So like traditionally, like a money service business is what the definition of a VASP is, right? So it's like you go to Western Union, that was the traditional, VASP without being virtual or an asset or digital asset, but it's virtual. And so this idea is that it's like, that was the traditional context up until this that was still the context in saying there's central media intermediaries. These are the Coinbases and Binances of the world. These are still these regulated VASPs. We can control them. They deal with a lot of payment flows. And it really comes down to this question of like transacting, right? So are you storing assets? Are you in charge of the directing of funds across users? And that's kind of the way that VASPs have historically been defined. And I think that up until now was the logical approach for FATF or these types of regulations. What they have done now is redefine that entirely and saying, okay, payment flows are now entirely open to the individual. So the best way to do this is to now assume all people can effectively be individuals. That is like an incredibly, in my view, like scary, approach, because now you're basically saying like people, humans, not regulated corporations, are now basically, have the weight of the full weight of enforcement, like potentially on us. And for the things that we've done in the past, or the things that we've built or contributed to in development, as an example, now we can carry that weight of enforcement action into the future when we may have not been a part of anything for a very long time. That is like a fundamental change into how regulation is done. That's not the way that they do this. And I think I said this a few times last week, like, I think Satoshi did what they did for a reason, right? Like to be everywhere and nowhere and to not know who it is this is why, right? Is that you can't be charged for money transmission violations because that's the nature of these systems, is like you can't be in control. Now they're asking us as developers or builders or even key signers, like DAO contract holders, you are now, have to bear the weight of your actions. That is a very interesting concept. And no one, I don't think, and to be honest, none of us even saw that coming. That was not the way that we thought that this would get approached.
Yeah, and I suspect it hasn't been helped by strong voices in the institutional side coming out and swinging their weight behind Bitcoin. And also the market has just been extremely frothy. There's a certain amount of weight attached to being labeled a VASP, isn't there? And so can you explain to me what you actually have to do if they give you that term and how onerous that actually is?
Yeah. So we run a VASP in Canada as an example. We're an early Bitcoin, buy and sell service in one of our businesses. And that is, we are a fully regulated entity. We are, it's the equivalent of being registered with FinCEN effectively. We have to implement KYC or compliance policies and programs. We have to have compliance officers that deal with procedure around, how do we onboard customers? How do we do counterparty verification? How do we do background checks, sanctions lists, politically exposed people's lists, searches? We're really trying to make sure that we know who you are and there's no historical link to criminality here. And then through that process, then it's also looking at how do the transactions themselves and what are the levels of transaction investigative increase. This is looking at it as when you onboard into a bank, that is what they're doing. It is no different. So to say that a human is now potentially required to do this, I mean, a DAO key signer, that's, and it seems to me that doesn't stop there. This is just the broadest blanket to throw to say you can basically call anything a VASP now. You can figure a way around it. You can figure out how to make that argument work. Regulators, do what you need to do here. So that is a fundamental change that I don't think we ever thought coming.
Well, I think that, and there seems to be this pushback to qualify what decentralized actually means. And I remember when Curve launched, it launched in the weirdest possible way. And it was very suspect, but you recognize that it had to be decentralized. They had to do something to mitigate whatever might come at them later down the line. And I definitely noticed last year, well, actually even the beginning of this year, that the teams were putting anonymous team as a plus point in their Medium articles. And nobody knows who we are. It's but when when you're faced with this reality, then you realize that decentralization is a meme. Of course it is, and it has been. True decentralization doesn't exist. So it's where on the sliding scale do we say yes, this is a decentralized entity? And I guess for me personally, my experience is coming through in 2017, which is where I started, and like I was just using every centralized exchange. I was doing a ton of ICOs, and I was giving my KYC and AML to literally everybody. Didn't care. Because I didn't care. I was a small fish. I was like, I don't care. I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you. Now, I know a bit more. And I'm like, I won't use a centralized exchange. I just won't. And that's because I don't need to and because the options are much better there. But what you're confronted with suddenly is a self-hosted wallet is not safe from them coming after you. A DEX could be, and rightfully, or could, is it right? I don't know, but it can be called a VASP. And then, of course, these guys are making a ton of money. They want to comply. They want to make sure the money machine keeps rolling in. So, like, what do you do? It was very telling that Uniswap has protected the code of version 3. Like, we are meeting a commercial reality here. And of course, regulation comes with that because if a product is regulated, then it's safe for consumers, and more consumers means more money. And we're really in that space right now, and it's fascinating. So how does that impact you guys at Shyft particularly?
I mean, like, so we built, like, it was kind of one of these things where, like, we really hope this doesn't happen, but we just couldn't see a world where, like, this didn't happen, to be honest. Is like, man, like, you know, the party will stop, the music will stop playing. Like, we all know that. And like, to the level that music stops playing is really the bigger question. Like, how do we build infrastructure that kind of solves like a multi-channel problem here, right? Like, we know that the exchanges have this big coordination problem. How do you know that Bitfinex and Binance are sending transactions between each other? They only have public addresses. That's one example. But then getting into the smart contract, piece, I think, of the space, it becomes tremendously more complicated. You don't have any intermediaries. You don't have a compliance department sitting in a DEX, right? That's just not how things work. And so, like, if we had to reimagine how all of these systems had to operate with some sort of compliance opt-in effectively, and whether that be on the asset type, so you can build a compliant, asset base, whether it's a liquidity pool directly, there needs to be like infrastructure that can go in to support any of these, what will be eventual form factors. And so we kind of built this saying like, we know that there's a centralized intermediary issue. There's no way that's not going to happen. Build an open system that kind of solves for that as a general purpose protocol, but also make it so that the moment these things start to look at, the decentralized aspect of it, you can really extend that and say like, there is some infrastructure here that can solve these challenges. You're not going to solve all of them, right? Like, as to your point, like, I really think like the decentralized, part of our space is like, it's all about trade-offs, right? Like, the more that users want to get a better experience, the more that they want, larger access to certain types of liquidity, especially on the institutional side, like there comes trade-offs in those types of systems, right? And that's okay, right? Like, some people will want the less, impressive UI and UX to be much more privacy focused, right? And then there's this trade-off of saying, you know what, I'm willing to kind of sacrifice some of that for this like kind of much simpler experience, much more, safety. And I think that that's kind of the way that I've always looked at the space. And I think that like, that's probably where everything goes. So to the extent that you have, different levels and layers in a DEX that have different qualities and different, onboarding pathways, that's the reality here. And everyone has their own choice, right? It's all about like decentralization and openness. It's all about choice. More choices we provide to the users, regulators, the different, users in our ecosystem. Regulators are a form of user in some capacities too. The more we provide those kind of options, the more things I think, work themselves out in some capacity. So,
how good is your Silicon Valley history?
It's okay.
It's okay. So there's obviously this historical precedent here, which is the battle for the soul of the internet way back when. I think it was the early 90s, when you had cable companies looking to basically just own it. And you had Bill Gates and chums step forward and say, we can self-regulate. And in that tipping point then being the birth of everything we now know as the internet. But back then, they were us. And they fought for what they felt they needed, which is to self-regulate. And they won. So there is hope that as a group, we could do that. Big difference, though. That was a bunch of guys who all knew each other, who had already made a ton of money in Silicon Valley, working together. And it's not like Windows wasn't a massive deal that was everywhere and they had the government in a chokehold. So how do we pool our power to do something similar,
And I think about this every day. Like, I think the biggest advantage that we have is like a decentralized ecosystem is that we are distributed, right? And all of our views don't align, right? It means that we can do this like incredible, innovative, distributed process. I also think it actually becomes our biggest weakness because like the ability for everyone to coordinate is like incredibly difficult. And I think that it actually, the messaging that the industry ends up revealing to everyone else is probably the wrong type of messaging that in this stage of the ecosystem's development, like we need like to show a lot of responsibility. We need to show a lot of coordination and kind of like a unified front in many ways. Right. And so I think that that's like the difficulty with, this coordination problem. But it's incredible on the innovative side. So like, I think that to be honest, like the regulators are sitting there saying like, they don't want to kill stuff. They don't know how else to solve what they view to be very big problems, right? Like, and so like regulation is just a response of saying like, we think that based on everything that we know and can see today, that this is the best way for us to, manage stuff. So like, that's where this all comes from, right? And like I do think the best thing that we can do as an industry is like build towards optionality and to say like, listen, there are ways to solve a lot of these risks. There's different user bases. That's okay. But like, if you don't start building infrastructure that like meets them somewhere in the middle, then they just say, well, like we can't do anything about that. And that world doesn't work for this population of, people that are coming into the space in our view, whether we agree with regulator view or not, they're the ones who kind of dictate a lot of, unfortunately, society today. And like, we need to like build towards that as an option, right? Like, it isn't about like eliminating decentralization and privacy and openness. It's about saying, listen, like there's many options here because like if we don't work with them, then they just respond like this, right? And that it gets worse. Like this is the beginning. In my view, I think this is like very much the beginning. We're about to see something really, really aggressive come out in the next 18 months, like much worse.
Well, that sounds bad. What do you think that could be? I mean, when you say really, really aggressive, and where is this coming from? Is this coming from the U.S. Treasury? Is this coming from the Biden administration? There must be a source for all of this. And I do remember that the last days of the Trump administration, they rushed through some FinCEN stuff. They were really trying to slap it on there. And it felt like Janet Yellen would be different, but she's not. She's exactly the same. She's exactly the same.
And I think like in my view, this is a continuation of that. I think this is saying, okay, one country can't approach this alone like the US and the Treasury did with Mnuchin. And so this is a much wider global coordinated event to say we need to really take action before this industry gets so big and out of control, which it already probably largely has to them in their view, which I don't really agree with at all. But like that's what the fear is like their inability to control things. If they don't approach it this way now, like the runaway effects become too great. And so that's like, I think where this is coming from. And I'm not going to point fingers on countries, but yes, like certain countries, the one you mentioned, they use the FATF to, apply global pressure. And this is very much, again, a Bitcoin has been like, I don't want to say weaponized, but this is now, or crypto, but like we're in a geopolitical arena now. And like our ecosystem is having impact. And like the regulators are saying, like, if we can't control it, we're going to try to kill it in some way. Right. And so the ability for them to hold things down is their best way of doing that. So yeah, I think that it gets worse in terms of like non-custodials. I think what we noticed like really quietly and very loosely in the paper was that there is a big opening now for regulators based on the guidance. And this is still guidance. Of course, this is not enforced regulation, but there is the ability for us to now say like under conditions of risk, we can now block things like on ramps and off ramps. So like the idea that you go to an exchange to, get US dollars or some equivalent or cryptocurrencies, the ability for them to just shut off the withdrawal function is now pretty much they're saying, listen, if you think it's the best, cut off all inbound and outbound transactions. And that means that you now have an entirely isolated, ecosystem that can't move its own liquidity. And that's one thing we were worried about, and it's very, very much present within this standards. So,
but on the plus side, one thing I've noticed about this space is that it's incredibly resilient. it's also, it won't be stopped. Like it finds a way. And also the speed with which things are deployed, built, broken and fixed and then rug pulled is beyond the scope of any regulator to fathom, let alone stop. So I trust in developers to drink more coffee than the regulators. Put it that way.
I think the incentives to build systems in our space far outweigh the incentives to, quickly write regulation. Like speed and regulation are like an antithesis, right? Like they don't work. And so our ecosystem is, I agree, incredibly innovative. And that's kind of what we're saying too, is like, let us innovate the solutions to what you view as problems, as opposed to like trying to throw things like this that just put us into the black category. Cause that's what it is like, it puts us like really into this like dark unknown. And like, we really need to make sure the ecosystem doesn't split itself in half. Like, that's what I think the bigger fear that we have is that you have this, quote unquote, like good part. And then you have this very like dark, shadowy, unknowing area. And that's the big fear I think that we have. So
I know I was talking to someone who comes from an entertainment background, and we share the same kind of cultural reference points, but we realized that the concept of money was changing, and it was changing in the weirdest way. It was changing from, a mathematical or Wall Street idea into one that is much more like a form of entertainment. And that is radical. And you said it was childish before, but like money is fun. Go have fun with it. But you're not gambling. You're just like, I enjoy making value, and then I can do stuff with that value. It's ludic, it's like that is all upside down. And that makes it, once you start thinking of money as art, as an art form like music or dance or cinema or anything else, it's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. But the world is not ready for that yet. But we realize that everything we talked about, and like, especially when you talk to developers about code, they talk about the artistry of the code and leaving their kind of signature on the way they code. It's all art, man. It's so strange.
Like it's a form of communication, and communication is meant to be exciting, right? Like that's the way.
Exactly, and people fundamentally have been told unremittingly that money is a problem. They don't have enough of it. The interest rates are crap. Like it's all the bank's fault. Everything's about to break again. And like, no, money can be really a lot of fun. And it can be really artistic, and it can be really, really, like vibrant and communicative with you. It is the weirdest thing. I'm still getting my head around it, but like, it comes down to also being a languaging problem. And I think so much of what goes on is about communicating in the right way to the right people at the right time. You said you were advocating for the space to people somewhere. Are you able to tell us kind of a little bit about who you're speaking to or what you might be telling them along those conversations?
Yeah. So this path kind of started, I'd say, like in 2016. So I started advising the OECD, which is kind of the policy division of the G20, let's call it. So they're there to kind of build policies to enable, I'd say just better lives and really more like standardizing how society works in that side, not on the financial side at all. So we kind of started in the OECD. We kind of helped found this blockchain, policy research institute that really was there to kind of say, listen, like we need good, real information on like what's happening here, not to take a negative view on this, but to say we can actually use this innovative technology to like progress things forward. So I started at the OECD, ended up writing regulations in about, I'd say like 6 to 8, maybe 9 countries. So we were the first digital asset regulations in Bermuda. And then that kind of as a Commonwealth framework for the ecosystem, we kind of spread that across, but probably maybe even 10 countries today have kind of adopted that type of framework. Again, build policy, meet the policymakers where they're at to keep our ecosystem like protected. Because it's like, if we have policies that work with how our ecosystem works, then you don't have bans and you don't have these things that are just absolutely counterintuitive. And then as of the last kind of 2 years, there's been an open group in the ecosystem that have been advising the Financial Action Task Force as really kind of I would say the voice and communication to the ecosystem. So that's a small group of people, but we've been in every meeting and for the last 2 years and trying to just, really explain like, hey, don't go after P2P. Like this is the same as cash. Like you don't regulate cash in your pocket this way. Why would you think this is any different? As like examples, looking at DeFi, it's a bit of a harder one to like, argue for, which is unfortunate. But like, again, it's all about like, we're trying to keep that communication active. And although things like this come out, we're trying to just say, listen, like, okay, let's talk through these things and make it work. So, yeah, that's the.
And does it? What's the response like? Do they listen, or are they pretty entrenched?
So they very much listen. Like I think that changing views is hard with anyone, right? There's no question. There is a lot of pre-world establishment here, and there's a certain way of doing things. There's also a lot of interests, I think, that are like, the space changes the economics of the world, right? The incentive structures of the world are largely get completely transformed here. So you have to think about that and like how that plays influence to global regulation. But I think that they've been incredible with us, at least like across our meetings. They're very much interested to learn. I mean, looking at this though, we're kind of like, okay, well, like that doesn't seem like what we like, kind of just doing stuff. But if you look at the depth of it, like these bodies are not stupid. Like their research, like that's the biggest thing about this paper that surprised me. I was like, whoa, this is like deep. Like they've thought through every piece. It may not make sense, and it may be really, I think, a big of an overreach, but like this is very well done. Like they know what they're doing. And so, yeah, they've been, I guess you could say, collaborative to an extent, but they also know the things that they're trying to solve for. And it's also that our ecosystem is not used to these types of illicit activity functions, right? So like we don't build this way. Our paradigm doesn't think in this world. And so, to hammer everything's a nail. And I think that works on a bit of both sides of the fence here, on the regulatory side as well as on our ecosystem side. So, yeah.
Well, look, there's no doubt we're probably reaching a critical moment for crypto. And in many ways, we should be glad that we've got here, because it means that we've reached enough import for these regulators for them to sit up and take notice and be worried about. But at the same time, you're just like, well, now what? And history hasn't been very kind to all of these things. So I guess, is there any voice or any kind of advocate that you want to reach to come and join your efforts to talk to these people? Someone who might have, some clout, and what would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like right now, what is actually more important is like we have the ear of the policy makers. Like our ecosystem is very well heard, right? I think it's the question of like, how are we going to all work together to manage that voice, right? And so I think like more so it's about saying like developers, people and participants in the space, like you're not competing with yourselves. This isn't always all fun and games. Money is fun. But like, we have to think of who the audience is right now, and how do we all come together as like a bit of a decentralized, centralized system in a weird way. It's so counterintuitive, but like, how do we all come together and kind of really articulate the right messages and kind of work? Because, this in the next 18 months will pretty much define the future of a lot of, I think, our interaction with the world.
During that conversation with Joseph, what really struck me was just how shocked he was by this latest set of guidelines. He clearly believed that what you might call an uneasy truce that's been the status quo for now was going to last for a lot longer. But when someone who's as deeply acquainted with the issues as he is looks that worried, then that makes me worried. Now look, I'm not saying that everyone is suddenly going to be considered a VASP overnight, but if we're not careful, regulatory powers are going to be able to attack one of the core tenets of decentralized systems, which is permissionlessness. If we don't have that, then what really is the point? It might as well just be traditional finance. And maybe you don't care, but policing and the justice system is very far from perfect. Plenty of humans have been wrongfully accused and wrongfully convicted. And it could just as well happen to you or me, whether you deserve it or not. So if you're concerned about what we've covered today and want to add your voice to the conversation, then the FATF wants to hear your views on that draft's guidance for taking the risk-based approach to virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. And it's asking relevant private sector stakeholders to take part in the public consultation by heading to the page linked in the description below. And that's it for this week. With thanks to Joseph Weinberg, this, with a note of caution, was the Defiant.